A narrator is determined to help his friend ride a horse, but what are the consequences to this? I discuss this and more on today's episode. Welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today I want to talk about a short story because it is Short Story Tuesday, and today's story is all about rural China and riding horses. I am referring to Galloping Horses by Zechen, which was published around 2012. I don't have a firm date on that. For those who don't know, Zechen is a Chinese writer who he did most of his learning in America and still writes in China. He seems to mostly write about the sort of marginalized people, not people who are prejudiced against, just people who are on the margins in China. You see rural people here in this story. He writes about a mute child in another story. And a couple of other poor people in Beijing and in other stories. And he's somewhat celebrated in China. I don't know the extent to it, but he's somewhat well regarded, has won a number of awards for his work. But I can't seem to find specific dates on anything that he's written, mostly because it's in, I don't know, maybe he's not that big of an author, but it's also on other websites, but they don't really list firm dates on anything as well. I will say this one was translated by Helen Wang. I think he writes in Chinese, and people have to translate his work. And so this one has been translated. So it might not be in the original Chinese, so I might lose a few things by not knowing Chinese. But I still think we're getting the original sort of message of his writing here, and I'm certainly glad to have found his work. I hope I can encounter more of it in the future. But without further ado, let's talk about Galloping Horses. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Galloping Horses focuses on an unnamed narrator who lives in rural China. They have a water buffalo that they take around for an unspecified reason, and that water buffalo eats grass and drinks water from the rural countryside. And as they're going through the rural countryside, they run into the two sort of ranchers, Hung Qi and Dong Liang, who seem like very indifferent men. They've let the narrator ride their horse in the past and made fun of him for it. But the narrator also encounters a small sort of teenager kind of person. I don't know how old this character is, but they call this character Soybean because he's so small and he's just sprouting up and everything. Soybean is curious about the horses and even wants to ride one. They ask the narrator about what their experience was, and the narrator promises to ask Hung Qi and Dong Liang about riding the horses, if it's at all possible. And the narrator asks, and the Hung Qi and Dong Liang say it's possible, but Soybean guards over or watches a melon patch for his father, and Hung Qi and Dong Liang want to be able to eat from the melon patch as much as they want in order for him to ride the horse, which Soybean says that's not really possible. He'll have to check and make sure that his father, or just check to make sure that his father doesn't catch them doing that, because his father counts the melons each night before bed, so he's going to know if a couple go missing. But a short while later, Soybean says that his father went to bed the night before counting the melons, and his father is away selling some melons now, so Soybean offers the melons to Hunky and Dongliang while his father is away. And then Soybean is given the opportunity to ride the horses, which Soybean is too scared to get on the horse. And so he just walks around with the horse and is somewhat content while the narrator rides on a horse next to him. Unfortunately, the father sees a roaming water buffalo near the melon patch and runs over there and sees that some melons have been eaten and split open, and some of them aren't ripe yet. So no one has been, or it seems like Hunky and Dongliang have been eating them, but just getting rid of the ones that aren't quite ripe. But then his father goes to look for a Soybean and sees that he's not in his shed, but Hunky and Dongliang are sleeping in there after eating some of the melon. And Soybean's father is angry and kicks out Hunky and Dongliang. They come running back to Soybean and tell him that his father is looking for him. And then a short while later, the narrator sees Soybean. There's kind of some red around him, indicating that he might have been beaten with a belt on the butt or something like that. And he's pretty sore. And then Hunky and Dongliang say that Soybean can ride the horses regardless. He doesn't have to put up any melons as a trade there. But unfortunately, Soybean says that he can't ride anymore, that he's kind of scared to ride, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there's a little bit worth talking about with galloping horses here. The main thing that's interesting in this story is the narrator's relationship to Soybean. The narrator and Soybean are pretty close, according to Zechen's writing. Maybe even friends. It's a bit unclear, but the narrator likes Soybean and cares for him a little bit, and Soybean is very curious about the water buffalo and is also interested in the narrator's story about riding a horse a couple times. So there's a burgeoning friendship growing there. But it could possibly be more than that. It seems to be brotherly in some ways, or it could even be like a father-son sort of relationship. I don't know how old the narrator is, but given that they're taking care of a water buffalo, and it doesn't seem to say that the narrator is doing it for their father, it's possible that the narrator is a bit of an older person, an adult. And so when they take care of Soybean, when they're hanging around Soybean, it's like they're doing what Soybean's own father doesn't do, and showing some care and attention and helping Soybean do something that maybe an experience he wouldn't get from his father. But it's a bit difficult to determine because Zechen doesn't tell you how old these characters are, and I feel like the age does matter, because it could just be a brotherly relationship, or it could be a father-son, but it's clear that something draws the two of them together, and maybe even the narrator has a duty to help Soybean ride horses, or teach him how to ride horses, because they're becoming close, and the narrator sees that Soybean is mostly lonely. No one really his age or his or who wants to hang out with him. So he somebody has to hang out with Soybean and help him and learn a little bit more about the world, which is very kind of him. The other thing that Zechen is talking about is consequences. Zechen shows that slacking off can lead to trouble. Soybean gets beaten for abandoning the melon patch, which is unfortunate, but maybe par for the course of what happens in rural areas. I see that happening in America, so it's probably something that also happens in China. Children get beaten for not doing their duty, or they get punished in some way. But there are also consequences for the narrator here. The water buffalo, unwatched, because it was the narrator's duty to watch this buffalo, now gets into the watermelon patch and makes things a little bit more difficult for Soybean. So it would have been one thing if Hung Ki and Dong Liang had eaten the melons, but it's another thing that the water buffalo just eats a lot of the melons without anyone doing anything to stop it. And not only that, but the water buffalo almost dies because Soybean's father kicks it in the head. So not only does the narrator have to deal with the fact that he got Soybean into more trouble, but he almost lost his livelihood because presumably the water buffalo helps the narrator with something on their farm or their homestead or whatever. So for Soybean's father to kick it in the head, that's not ideal. That's bound to create some trouble, and it's all because they slacked off. They took Soybean away from his duty, and the narrator was no longer watching the water buffalo, and so they got into trouble. So essentially, Zechen is kind of highlighting the importance of sticking to your responsibilities and not just slacking off there. So those are my thoughts on Galloping Horses by Zechen. It's an okay short story, not anything particularly special, but if this is all about talking about the weird and the strange and the around part, and so it was important to talk about a Chinese author on here. I feel like I don't do that quite enough as compared to talking about Western writers. I do think it's a bit weird that it sort of just has Soybean get beaten. Like there's a consequence for giving someone what they want, which sometimes that's how Eastern, non-Western writers really write, or not even non-American writers, because not every story necessarily has a positive ending. Sometimes unfortunate things happen in the world, and this is an example of that. So it's an interesting short story, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I will put a link to it in the description if you are curious about it. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear from you and possibly have a conversation here. Until then, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about Galloping Horses or this author if they do not already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and rural China-related travels. Farewell.